So a practical approach to building settings, designing them also, and then alongside of that, let's say a step towards concretizing this whole Oxel thing, which is something I've been in actually in conversations alongside this week, which maybe might be good material later, but not for now, because let's try to be concrete first. So now I actually kind of wanted to start from the material here, because I was thinking about this question by going through various game structures, like and looking at how does this sort of structuring happen towards something like, in this case, text, becoming more like an ecosystem. So how is the behavior built? And this particular one is, I think, just as good a starting point as any. And I want to just highlight a couple of qualities. You don't have to read the whole text in itself, by the way, but it's there as material. Of course, this is describing a creature, an entity called giant grosbeak, which, by the way, is pictured here, which is part of the, of course, the expression of it. But rather than going to the picture, I wanted to point out a couple of things. Now, here we see, like, first, there is what would be normally thought of as almost like a biological description, although it's nuanced differently, which is important, but we can go to this later. So there is a description of this entity, a bird. But in this description, we already see like a like there's this nuanced shift towards like trying to make it functional, because what the text wants to give is actually how to, let's say, bring alive, figuratively speaking, this creature. It's not just like about witnessing it, it's about actually fabricating it to existence. But I would say, like, this basic description and how it's approached could even be better towards it, but I think we can highlight some of the traits that are already like serving that that possibility of this sort of fabrication. There, like, this sort of sentence is like where it starts, like, giant grosbeak rarely sings in captivity, which already entails behavior in itself, and beyond that, there is, like, the second paragraph is mostly physical traits. Stands about 3 feet tall, and so on, and also where they come from, and so on. And then there is a cultural reference, or cultural plus like effect reference, like in the last paragraph, the grosbeak song can sway even the hardest heart. That's more like the effect of it. But then cultural musicians try to capture its essence in their compositions, but no imitation comes close. I swear, by the way, this connection between bird songs and music is synergistic, accidental synergistic effect. I didn't think of this. I had this already on in the background, but interesting that it does refer to our conversation beyond the recorded session. But okay, so that's all fairly normal. But then of course, there's a bunch of numbers, which is more about the game system in itself, like something that we can mostly like leave aside for now. But I would rather put the aim towards the column on the right, which has this sort of special abilities, merits, social charms. in and of themselves. Like so, for example, in the social charms, you have this ancient lullaby. The grosbeak song resembles a lullaby from the target's childhood, tiring him, or if he's already asleep, driving him deeper into slumber. And then after that, there's a bunch of game mechanics and so on. But now, if we kind of take a step back, there's other stuff, and we can maybe like shortly show it. There's also storyteller tactics, which is more for the game master, like general notes, but we can more focus on the first page and, like I said, take a step back. There's something interesting happening here if we kind of look at the woods for the trees. And first of all, of course, it's probably clear that there is a presence of a system or systems, how this is being made. That actually, to fabricate this entity into being, a system is necessary, or at least helpful, to exist. And then towards the system, there are these sort of different approaches, like packaging up. Like, yes, there are social charms, but the social charms take this form of like modules, like ancient lullaby, which are about effects and so on. And I want to kind of contrast that with imaginary example. Like, let's say you were describing a role, because ultimately this entity is kind of like a role in its form. And in that role, there would be something akin to this, let's say, this ancient lullaby, and it would say the songs or whatever lyrics or written poems of this role summon the target's childhood. But then beyond, like if we think that how this would be played, let's say this role was made for a normal person, and we of course cannot instill superpowers or powers in the sort of beyond the human capability sense to people. What if it said like the, let's say, the songs or the poems of this role are read or are taken to reflect on the reader's childhood. Now, what's happening here potentially is taking something that, for example, in these kind of texts are written in the form of power, because it's a fantasy, imaginary, fictive world. So it's easy to give such powers, but they are rather moved to focus. That somebody, say, listening to the songs of this coming from this role, or the person using it, are to be read or to be reminiscent in terms of the childhood itself. And why I point that out first is it's a kind of a take on how something that is made in the language of power, by turning it into focus, you're turning it both into play, and you're still having an effect. Like if somebody would, let's put it in the form of poems, and somebody would take a role, and the role would be that they have this capability of writing poems that are taken in to be reminiscence of the reader's childhood, and then somebody getting them would read them, oh, this is reminiscent of my childhood, there would still be an effect. And most likely the childhood would become present or not. And therefore the play structure would in itself create something similar. So not as like blatantly powerful, but still tracing a similar direction. And that's one direction I want to outline from here. But then second, towards this sort of oxel and oxelization, like now we can break this down into, like in this particular game, which for the sake of reference happens to be Exalted 3rd edition, which doesn't really matter, but just to recognize the sources. This is a system to create an entity. And in this system, there are these patterns that are used. But if we look at woods from the trees, we could think that there is this pattern that could be called, for example, traits. And you could say that there would be an entity oxel, and then it could have like this description of traits, and traits would be their own oxel, which has this sort of pattern of how to make such. Like how to make, for example, something like this sort of ancient lullaby, or something like the version I made imaginarily, so of poems reminiscent of childhood. So in a way, you could have this sort of pattern that essentially to define, for example, an entity or anything, even a location, you could have this sort of almost like a palette or template of types. Those types would have then their own template, how to make them, and really making such a thing would be like filling those types in. So, for example, if I would want to make a general template for traits, I could say for that there has to be a description of an effect. Or maybe a description of the operation or action, and then description of the effect. And then on the side of it, I could have some examples. I could have, for example, the case of this sort of ancient lullaby, and having this sort of description of it's by this trait, the poems written by this person are create reminiscence of the reader's childhood. And maybe that's it. Maybe there's nothing else there, but that is simply an effect that is kind of implied in a playful sense. But then, like zooming out from there, that creates a sort of possibility that if I want to create a role in a kind of a setting like framework, I could simply create this types. I could create templates out of them, and then creating different instances, new instances to it, I would simply fill those templates in new forms, and new instances would appear or would be created. And I like, that's a very that's a high level overview, hopefully somewhat sensible. I have other examples of this, and then maybe that can concretize a bit. So let's take a just slightly different type. This is like the pattern is similar here, but different also. So even in the description, we have of this daub trout. There's like a general description, which is fairly combat oriented in some senses, but actually kind of interesting, which is like when this is present, you suddenly begin to question your mission. But then so very active in a sense. But then underneath that, actually even the kind of description is turned into modular units like drain confidence. In the presence of these fey, so the dove trout are fey fishes, one is drained of confidence and doubt begins to take over. A strange tingling sensation can be felt all over the body. By the way, just to point out, like that is in itself an effect description in a game. And yes, it's very interpretational. Like running that in a game is kind of very much up to the players, but it can still work, which I think is a word of encouragement for this sort of interpretational operations and interpretational moves in play. But then there, like even this kind of things like on the left side of things, the aura of doubt. I mean, this is very game mechanical. Creatures within 30 feet of doubt crowd have a disadvantage of saving throws. But if you look beyond all of that, like, and think of more like this drained confidence description, that you could have this sort of like whenever this role is present, people start to make questions towards their confidence. And once again, playfully, it's not giving power, it's more giving focus, but it's likely to have an effect in itself.
I'm sorry, can you bit distinguish between power and focus for a sec?
Oh, okay, yeah. So, like in the language of this game, like if you look at the sort of aura of doubt, or if we pick actually also the earlier case of the ancient lullaby. Now, when it says the grosbeak song resembles a lullaby from the target's childhood, tiring him, or if he's already asleep, driving him deeper into slumber. This is very much power, like somebody has the power of tiring somebody. It's like just saying that. And in a kind of fictional, like language-based game world, this can happen. Like the other creature that they're tiring also exists in language description, and therefore we can apply this power in itself. Like this is like direct effect, therefore power. But then focus rather would be, because it because it's hard, for example, between people to say, certainly to say like you have a power of flying. Well, you probably won't. But you could say like in this case, like whenever you read a text coming from this person or hear the song of that person, reminiscence your childhood in relation to the text or the song.
Right. So
that is focus.
Yeah. So basically, what you're doing there is you're a bit recalibrating what would be the effect across the border from, as you said, like a language captured game to human interaction, like live people interaction, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And on the game side, on the fictional written side, you call that a power, because we can just imagine that to be a power and we can calculate whatever effect it might have. On the human side, it's like one places it in the kind of shared imagination of that space that one occupies together.
Yes.
And one, okay.
Yeah.
Small side note, just because of this kind of recurring theme or thread, and we don't have to comment on this, but I just want to touch it here. That's also a material recognition, right?
How do you mean? Like
by which I mean that, like, we understand. You remember that we've been kind of knocking on this point of like material agnostic or media agnostic multiple times, and so now, like, it's a recognition of that, like the fiction, the language bound universe functions or like requires or works better with different ideas, different mechanisms, or how you want to say, concepts that than the human, like body bound, spatially mediated interaction.
Yeah, and
super small side note, and we don't have to spend any time on this, but it's just like maybe just a record for myself also.
yeah, and I do think this is kind of like agreed upon, like in this, when I say media agnostic, I mean that it can figure itself out in any media, but that does not take away that certain media have certain strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't make the media neutral, but it's just like that it's not, like, you know, a painting is defined partially by being that media. Whereas here, the game could be put in other media, like even in here, the picture is, or the image is contributing the whole. And if somebody decided to this text, add, here's the sound of this bird, people would be okay. Or here's the smell of this bird, people would be okay, because it is essentially kind of inclusive in terms of whatever media you take, but it doesn't take away the characteristics, strengths and weaknesses of a particular medium. But yes, like they do have the sort of
little transfiguration maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, but thanks for this.
Yeah.
Super.
So yeah, like to make this sort of like how these texts are written with this sort of perspective of power, because that's what these games are that is possible in them, and that you're simply describing effects and that things have on things because you can do that. But that becomes limiting if that's your perspective of creation of this, let's say, game moves, if you're thinking about people in general. But if you translate or transfigure that power perspective into focus perspective, which means some nuanced calibrations, yes, but it's while not like transfigure everything to everything kind of a channel, it's still a fairly wide channel. It just means like you have to be clever about how you do it, but you can do a lot of it, and that is interesting in itself as a quality. Because it kind of moves it into it. It's not so much that it's not really about what we're giving you extra powers. It's more about consider it from this point of view, which kind of in a weird way is a power, because it then becomes your concern, your focus. So that's one of the reasons why this transfiguration can work. But beyond that, like there is also this like in terms of Oxel being this idea that you can create this sort of kind of templates or types, and then you can combine them to be larger types. Like you can potentially already imagine that, let's say for a certain setting, for example, there is a way to make new entities or locales or whatever to it. But how it's expressed is like expressed in this sort of different, like if we think of this, what here are abilities, merits, and charms, we could simply think of as traits. And there is a description of the trait as like create an action, a description of the action, and description of the effect, and the effect in the sense of focus. And then you have examples, and that can work as a type, as a template for making more entities or locales or whatever else towards that setting itself. So it's creating kind of systematic architecture towards not just the existence of it, but the expanding of it. Does that make sense? I know it's somewhat abstract, but I do think there is a sense towards that idea. Also, because I do think it might still be a bit abstract, like any questions about my lack of tangibility are very welcome, or also comments. You can probably sense I'm fishing for comments or questions because I'm talking too
much. Maybe it will become you gave Linda and me the right to take you up on the practicality of the session.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it will become also clearer in the practical part.
Yes, I was thinking like this direction already kind of like paints towards practicality. And the practicality could be like, even for any setting, that we could say, if one would take this case of, let's call them traits, and the traits would be really this sort of like how to create an effect in the sense of focus. And that would be the only thing that they have to do, that they are like modular, like even if I kind of simplify from the sort of example of this ancient lullaby, and to that I want to give a trait which is about writing poems, and then those poems having or being read with observations, reminiscence about the reader's childhood. Like, how would I write that trait? And like in its simple form, I could say, let's put this in a form where there is simply action. I mean, sort of neutral, but maybe it can work for now. Action, writing poems, and then effect, which is like whenever these poems are read, they are read from the point of reminiscing about the reader's childhood. I mean, not the best verbalization of it, but like that description in itself is, I think, like in simplicity functional. But I created now two things. I created, first of all, that particular thing that, let's call it like poems of childhood memory. So I kind of created that thing in all its simplicity. Probably can create it more nuanced fashion in some manner, but that's enough for now. But I create another thing. I created a template, which is like whenever you create a trait, give it a name, give it an action, give it an effect. And then maybe in that template, there could be description of what kind of, how to describe the action, how to describe the effect. For example, in the effect, you could say, make the effect not so much having a direct effect, like a power, but make it to have an effect of focus and consideration.
So,
and do say.
Yes, just to say, because I think that was not very clear. So what you're saying is like, you phrase it once, and you, by like, as you say, you phrase it so that a particular role which you're just imagining. So you imagine yourself in the position of somebody who's basically creating a game, right? Who's in the process of imagining and creating a game that would be played by people, as for example an organizational, like a game to kind of further some organizational imagination or development or whatever. Yes. And then you say, okay, so there's a certain role which I now suggest, and that role has the trait so and so. And by that, by saying that, and by saying what the trait then would be, as you just did, you created that trait. But by structuring it the way that you did, so the effect is that, and can be played so and so, that's the template that you can then apply to the next role.
Yes.
Or also not apply to the next role.
Yes.
Because I think that's like, so, okay, finish up one first. So that you basically, it's a bit like in typography, you offer yourself a grid that on the next page is still the same grid. And you can put stuff into it. And then on the next page, it's still the same grid and you can do that. So it's a bit like a chart. It's a bit like a matrix, right?
Yeah.
That's nice and clear. I think that could be a fun thing even to do. Both kind of in terms of kind of thinking up specific traits, but also thinking up how one can write those.
Exactly that, yes.
That could be super fun.
Yeah.
And another thing just at the side of it, but that's for later, but just because I'm thinking about it now, is what I've been enjoying in games that I have seen is that when you look at the kind of whole, scope of maybe cards in play or so, that some fulfill some parameters, but not all fulfill all parameters, right? So that you have a certain kind of landscapiness between, the different kind of characters in play, like where some just simply did, so some have a certain kind of capacity that plays out in a certain way, others just don't have any of that. And they have another type of skill that is written and conceived in a very different mechanic, which I think is very rich. So you don't kind of come to this kind of formulaic, he has 5 in that slot, they have 4 in that slot, he has 7 in that slot, and so you see what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, like essentially there are many very different types of approaches to formulaicness or systems. Oh, I think we have a guest that is on the wrong channel. Maybe I'll address that. Hello, Jorge.
Hello, guys.
Are you on there? So there is a session ongoing.
Sorry about that. I might have got the wrong room. I'll see you guys later.
No worries, no worries.
Okay.
See you later. So this was a track of Excel social life. But yes, like going back to the sort of formula, that there are many types of formulaicness or system likeness, and that system does not necessarily have to be hard slots, like you said, like numbers. In a way, it is a system and formulaic way. If you say, oh, there's a type of a trait, and every trait contains an action and an effect, it's a formula. But because that formula is fairly open, it's still having a formulaic effect, but there is a lot of expressive room in that.
I don't think that's an opposition, but I think I wanted to also just maybe how to say preference, or like maybe nudge a little bit to the question if we could maybe just be writing up some of these traits and the template deform. I don't know if that's anybody else's wish, but I could find that to be funny. So that's why I wanted to say, like, that latter note of mine was not meant to really now take any time, take up any time. I mean,
yeah, and like I would be up for it, and that was partly why to start with this sort of, in a way, super simple, probably could be better. There's action effect, trait being action and effect starting point, because it's not the point that this is the best system structure, but the point being like to well, first of all, highlight the double effect. That when you're creating this, or even creating a specific form of it, you're creating one thing, but you're creating a type at the same time, which in itself is powerful. But it's also like something towards the sort of it's expressive towards a setting, a world, realm, whatever, because it's kind of giving it's expressing towards what are connecting elements between things, and it's also expressing towards what is a particular thing, but also how you can create new particular things by using the sort of systematic in itself. So even starting from the simple things or coming up with new expressions and new template-like patterns in those expressions, you're already kind of entering into, let's say, the Lego block side of setting making. And this is really the heart of Oxels as well. And to underline that is because the template part of this is really an Oxel. Like if you make like an entity contains of traits and maybe a description, but maybe that description has some system like qualities, maybe about how do you create them, but you say it contains a description and traits, and that's an Oxel for an entity. It's not the world's best one, but it is a one, precisely because it's at the same time providing a template while creating a framework to create instances. So we're really with this, we're kind of at the Lego blocky side of both creating kind of simple Oxels, but also at the Lego blocky side of how to create things like settings, for example. Does this make sense to others? I think, Martin, you clearly got it, and I'm supporting you on terms of creation of this, but like just to include everybody else into the conversation.
Yeah, I think I want to start doing something with that.
Yeah, agreed. What about Linda, Jakub?
It does definitely make sense to me as well. I would like almost to try in practical.
Yeah.
See what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, I think it's similar for me here. It's interesting. And
yeah,
the part
and there, do say.
No, I was saying that it's really interesting, and I'd like to also to try a bit practically, because it seems to me that the palette of what is possible is so great. So I'd like to experience how to be playing with it in such a way that, yeah, that there's because I can have a tendency to get lost if there's too many possibilities, and I know that it's kind of a skills game. But so yeah, so I'd like to experience how to be playing with it.
Like a short addition to that, and then we can go to practicality. There is a kind of a reason why to keep it that simple, and that simplicity of like just doing this opens this space is kind of then putting this really an expressive question in two ways. The expressive question being like, what's the content? Like, okay, like, is it interesting to make poems to that then people read it in the play-like atmosphere by intentionally reflecting them on their childhood? That's like content question. Is it like an interesting trait? But then it also opens up this question: is this an interesting, say, this sort of action effect? Is it an interesting way to make traits in general? And like, and the simplicity of it opens up a huge room, as like in this sense, like, okay, what if the pattern is not action effect, but it's like action effect lingering question, that somehow like every trait has a lingering question that it leaves for every player, and suddenly we are playing a quite different game. But this is precisely the kind of expressive room that it opens up. And just as quick examples, I will give a couple of other examples of oxelizing. Because I found that actually looking at entities and creatures was one of the richest ways of finding different structures. Like this is another book which is more in the OSR school of thought, but here is an entity called Flip Face, which is an unfinished artwork come to life. But like here, like the format is quite different. It actually has trigger and effect, which is kind of action and effect. But then there is like always an trigger type, and like Flip Face, the creature is nearby. And then there's an effect. Any object that has a face, statues, children's dolls, etc., appear angry. Tools resist being used to start any new art. Brushes are repelled from canvases. Chisels won't touch marble. Sticks refuse to mark lines in the sand. Which, by the way, in this style of gaming, this is very interpretational. Intentionally, this is all you get. But it still works. But then like you have just a row of different triggers and different effects in itself. So it's already kind of proposing a different template in itself. So yeah, like, but I would be up towards creating this, and maybe we could use even, should we create them in terms of conversation, or do we need a textual document? I could try to open up a mirror board for that.
How about, or like suggestion, adding to this, how about writing some on our own and then giving back?
Yeah, that's a good idea. And that we can do without like having to do logistics of opening new platforms in and of themselves. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
And for the writing, like you're free to break everything. Like you're free to make a different template style. If you want, of course, you can use the mentioned ones, but and it can be just as drafty as you want it to be.
So so that we kind of have a bit of a guide, like we think of traits for a role, like to begin with anyway, wherever it wants to be ending up. But like to begin with, we think of traits for a role.
I think it might be a good, like that there is some limitation, like changes, of course, welcome, but like it might be a good, like very open, but still somewhat directed.
And this could be such a limitation, right?
Yeah.
And the position we put ourselves in is that we are imagining, well, maybe we don't need more. Maybe this is enough, no? Of a boundary.
Yeah, you're, maybe one can say like you're imagining something that you could give to let's say a person, a wide sense
Like a real person.
Yes. And then that would become something that expands their range, not as a power, but more like how something that person does can move the concern and focus really the play area to something else.
I need to plug myself in, it will be a bit chaotic.
What would be interesting, but maybe also too limiting, if we write roles for each of us. Like I write a role for Linda, for example.
You could use that as even your approach, like, and anybody who wants to follow that could utilize that. That you can address it to a specific person. If your ideas don't fit that, then you can do another take. I already started, but maybe we can say that we can give this, say, 5-ish minutes or so, and then start sharing. If somebody needs more time, maybe they don't share first. Have you had any luck on your explorations? Any findings? Anybody, I guess practically one could put it like anybody who wants to start sharing can start sharing. And you can also, if you really want, I can start sharing, but I would rather have it be somebody else, because otherwise I'm probably on once again too much in the voice of definition, so to speak.
I can start if you want.
Yeah.
Okay. So I tried to use the theme we had before the actual conversation started about kind of your room. We see Linda and the plant and the music instrument. So I defined these different entities for a musician, and like I added trigger to the, or I didn't define. I had my issues with the trait, but I will speak about that a bit afterwards. So I have a trigger, I have action and effect. And I defined the trigger, the sound of a plant that is being watered, which causes the action that the musician or whoever plays that role pours water into different glasses and starts to play melodies. And these melodies, they can either be in harmony or in disharmony. And the effect of that is that there's kind of a sound layer that is overlaying the entire scene, which creates a certain mood or an atmosphere, which again is different every single time and has to be defined, or doesn't have to be defined, but it's just different all the time. And now I was thinking about like the role and the traits are interrelated. So because, or at least for me, I figured like, okay, the musician, it is inherently. Then I started thinking, okay, what are possible traits for a musician? And I kind of came up with musician can be the performer, or it also can be the composer, or it can be both. And like there it starts to become interesting, because like how do we want to create this role? And I'm not yet like I'm just sharing my thoughts what happened when I was creating this setup. And there is no final conclusion yet, or if there is no final conclusion, I assume.
Yeah, I think it's. I don't think there is final conclusion in general, because it's kind of like an expressive space, which is, I think, an interesting quality about it. Like you said, like, I mean, trait is a useful thing to start towards a role, because it's a kind of general take on like the role turning into something more aspected, specific, but nothing kind of forces that it has to be traits. Like it could be anything really. Like it's more like there to provide an easy starting point, but you could compose it completely without traits as well. And of course, these things don't have to be even roles. They could be locations. Maybe those are used to make locations that are overlaid on real locations, and they have a certain kind of oxelized approach to help people to create things that are overlayable. And then the question is, well, what kind of structure you would give to people that they can more easily create things that are overlayable on real places, which is a creative question, certainly approachable, but like there's no right answer to that either. But yeah, I kind of like precisely kind of as any creative space, it's the exploration that brings the interesting forms out of it, I think, and it has to be explored, like, which is why I think Martin's idea of doing this practical is a good one, because it's about exploration.
I only have 10 minutes. I have to go at 4:45. So maybe I just share what I thought. So in terms of the traits of the role, so it's for about, as in like in a Zoom conversation, so in a Zoom room. And I thought about the role of the disturber. And the disturber is restless, scattered, organizationally confusing, and unplaceable. And the aim of the disturber is making sure that there are no moments of silence, disturbing the conversation with unrelated comments, and insinuating in the discussion with questions that are not pertinent. And I was thinking of actions like raising the eyebrows, or like actions that are obviously just readable through the Zoom windows. So yeah, this is mainly my role and the traits of the role.
So who did you write the role for, Linda? Because you said you're writing it for someone.
I don't like this tweet because I'm in it.
What, or do you want to keep that particular person secret if you had it for someone?
No, it's not for anyone. It's just I'm just imagining Zoom. It's not necessarily this scenario. It's just in a Zoom conversation, and it's often yeah.
But that is a good example also, like, because it's a sort of expressive space. Really, wherever you start with, you can start to figure out it. Like, for example, now that you start from the disturber, it's both figuring out how a disturber could be expressed and shared or communicated to somebody, be that, which is like for me, this is one of these key questions: how to go towards expression that is not just about telling people things, but go towards expression which is about affecting the behavior, not in a sense of commanding them to behave, because all of this is really in the realm of offers. Like you cannot really by this kind of description force somebody to be a disturber, but it's kind of like you could be this, which is then much more about expansion of space and behavior. And that's a way to start to figure out the space, for example, starting from the disturber, but then you could start from any direction, but all of those directions are contributing to, it's almost like we're at the very, like we have stepped off the boat to this land. And if you start walking that direction, it's probably useful because there's something to be learned there. But if you start walking on that other direction, it's also useful because you start to learn from there, which is kind of like a state of exploration of novel ground.
Yeah, and as you said, the behavior that role then engenders within the dynamics of the scene or the setting at large. So
Yeah.
all this ensemble of behaviors, of roles that then turns into behaviors and sort of guide as well then the path of the whole setting.
Mm-hmm. Agreed, definitely, yeah. Anybody else wants to share?
I can share my scattered process because I don't think I created an outcome, but I created some scattered bits and pieces. Because for me, so I was like writing down, okay, so now I want to write this kind of entity, but then my like normal or default concern came up, and it's like, oh, but I need a purpose, even temporary or kind of like an exercise purpose, because otherwise I don't have the field in which this would be meaningful for me. So I needed to construct some, and I was okay, so I will write it for me and for a specific situation. So I was writing some document yesterday at night, like very near to the deadline, and it was completely frustrating. I was like, okay, so I can create a card or a thing which would be called, perhaps, I didn't know yet if it's like a a kind of, so I had like 3 things come up. One of those was like a repurposer or purposeer, that, okay, so the context is that you are in a situation that you feel as being as a prison, and you are faced with a dead or deadened work to be done, which doesn't have any meaning for you. So this role can help somehow how to say it? Yeah, breathe in some purpose. But then I was, okay, but this is boring, or this is not like, so I tried a bit different role, and I got like, okay, so it's a prison victim, and the trigger is now you find yourself in the situation that you feel this looming imprisonment of the work and of the writing, and you cannot focus. And then so the action or the effect is that immediately it makes you blurt out what is the implicit truth. So it's like, oh, so I'm in prison and I'm out missing on life, and I'm bound to this meaningless task which will not bring me anything, and I will fail anyways. So this is the mantra that it can like bring out, and and then the yeah, and then then I was like, okay, so but this is, I'm kind of part of the card or entity, is that, oh, you put on yourself the victim role, and you visit the bitter place. And I was like, but okay, but what good would it do, right, if I'm already in there? So why would I do it to myself? And then I realized, okay, this might be actually a good thing or useful, because the trigger, actually, I can use this not in the moment when I am stressed out and before the deadline, but for example, now when I remember, oh, I should do some things in the following days. So I will trigger this entity, I will put on the victim and the imprisoned person, and I will go through the process sooner before, and perhaps like getting myself there could help me actually escape it sooner than it's the reality or something like that.
Harmonic.
Mhm. But I think there's so many directions, like waypoints coming from what you're saying. It's actually quite fertile. Like you could, like when you say you are in prison, like I could imagine like somebody creating a local, maybe an overlay to a real place is like, I mean, there could be more to it, but maybe just this idea that this is a prison. Like you're in a playground for whatever reason, maybe with some people, and then you overlay this as a prison. Well, that's a change, and that in itself is an interesting direction. Probably more interesting if you have more to it, but it's just pointing out the effect itself. Then that made me think about like, okay, a different kind of pattern for this oxalized description is maybe like a thing that starts with a ritual, which is like, maybe the ritual is like everybody says, I am in prison because, and then they come up with their own description, and this goes around. And this is actually the first trait, that you always have an initial ritual in this particular trait description. So let's say it's the sort of overlaying of a locale, and it's a prison, but it starts with this ritual that everybody says, I'm in prison because X, Y, and Z. And then after that, there is some action, sure, but that's already kind of telling of a different pattern and different kind of like system presence in itself. And of course, this is still just really expanding the space, but it's also like pointing out how there is like interesting qualities. And like if you start with this kind of ritual, then it makes you think, oh, okay, what kind of rituals we could have? Like that's a ritual that comes first to my mind, but there would be so many. And then it would create very different traits or different oxels in a way, like to use that versus something else. Okay, I can share as well. Like, I think Martin hasn't shared either, but I can try to be short to not take too much time. I kind of intentionally, oh yeah, yeah, Linda said she has to go. So, but okay, I intentionally picked like, I will look at the kind of system end of these things because maybe that's something that I would be contributive of. And I thought like, okay, there is this sort of, sure, this sort of action effect pattern is a good general pattern, but like a quite different pattern would be, let's say that there's always a description of a start and an end. That is the start being that if you have this trait, you have the power of setting a start. And then there's a whole range of what the setting of a start could be. Like maybe the setting of the start is that everybody stops. Or maybe the setting of the start is that everybody picks one position to stand in, whatever it is. Like, but then because it has the structure of start and an end, it's like you can set a start and then you tell what do you think is the end. And maybe the end is can be very interpretational. Like maybe your setting of a start is like you can ask everybody to pick a spot in a particular locale, but then you set a start. A start is like or the end is like a sense of communication, like intentionally very poetic. Now, what happens then that you can set that everybody picks their spot and you said, now, once we find or somebody finds a sense of communication, then this ends. And just by that pattern of a system, not having action and effect, but having start and an end, there is a very different behavior. But then I thought of a relative of that was like a method and a goal, which is like, well, the end was kind of a goal itself from the earlier form, but then like what if a method would be awkward movement? Of course, the method could be way clearer than that, but just to point out that there is this sort of like poetic quality to system description, like you could make a method that is just awkward movement. It's probably a lot of other things, but it will have awkward movement. And then the goal could be like even finding something or finding something valuable. So what kind of a situation that creates? That's also rather different. Then I thought like, okay, now this is moving in traits. Like from the game side, we could see this, that there's like this combination of definition and traits, like, or description and traits. But like what kind of other things we can find here? And of course it's a large bunch, but just to point out a couple of interesting ones. What if one is defining arcs? And by arcs, I mean that it gives a person a power to set like certain kind of like a continuation. This happens, this happens, this happens. And it would have like just then underneath the arc would be essentially waypoints that you would have like point 1, point 2, endpoint. And this would then form more like pathways, not necessarily concrete pathways of where we walk, but like we first find something valuable, then we come to discard its value, and then at the end we still take something from the value that we discarded. Now here once again, maybe the value is not in these raw examples, but more like, oh, that's a different pattern again. And this is kind of what I'm looking at, this, that how much power there is this in this sort of dance between what is systematic template-like, pattern-like, and what is content-like. That both sides can change things. But then, because there's the system, there's also a creation of a type that, like, this sort of arc structure is then, oh, I can see how you made the arc. Here's my arc, and now here's a collection of arcs. Here is a system setting where people actually just push different arcs towards their behaviors. What does that create versus these other models?
Like easing curves in like animations.
Yeah, precisely. You're already kind of opening that space up. Now, I didn't think of easing curves, but now that you mention it, it becomes an interesting, like, what are even human behaviors with there's easing curves in itself? And there were many, but I'll highlight another one, which was like an item. And this is kind of like from earlier XORG, like inheriting that there is, it's this idea that like you can, whenever you find a particular item, like a physical item, you can like superimpose some quality on it. Like for example, let's say it's a pen, but you impose on that pen that whenever you pick it up, you spend 1 minute in stillness thinking about what is it going to do, which is now the item itself, like a physical object has another layer, and then just giving these sort of qualities of items, then you create a whole nother environment again. So yeah, those were my examples. Oh, I think we're ending soon in any case, but like, I think we have, unless your laptop that is dying soon, if you want to get dramatic last words, as the laptop might die at any moment.
No dramatic last words. But as usual, I find it always very interesting to start thinking about these kind of patterns in different dimensions. Like, or I understood it, what you said right now is like thinking in a qualitative, but also in a quantitative way of how to create these setups, like creating a certain kind of rhythm of how often something can happen, or like more this kind of thinking in vectors. You have a starting point and then you push it and something happens, and that, or like after, I don't know, when a laptop dies, or after, I don't know, 10 minutes, something happens, or like also thinking about these kind of structures.
Yeah, it's also because whatever, like, this is kind of like dance between creative structure and creative, I don't know, content. There's probably a better word for it, but structure includes everything quantitative, because really maths is just one structure in itself. Like, so it kind of just eats that up and says like all of this can be used. But I think where we're coming from here, which is like all these sort of Oxel thoughts have been very abstract, but I do think like from here, there's a certain practicality or simplicity of looking at, okay, this is actually a field of expression, and figuring out how to use it is just to make it. Like already many of these ideas are quite interesting. Like what is like these kind of things in terms of their effect on human behavior. And of course, they don't even have to be just human targets. Like in the one example, it was items. So, or location. So really anything. And that as a communication, that's a huge field. Like, but then being able to communicate that is kind of like, I think, where the Oxel is essentially trying to go, or trying to underline that possibility, and this is opening the possibility, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and the act of creating these structures in the sense of creative structures is already kind of a big part of the exercise, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the key part. Is really,
yes,
because
exactly.
those actually do the double take that they are in itself interesting structures, but they also create an experience of what does it mean to be in that space,
Yeah.
and make you learn that space from
Yeah.
the forms that you create.
Yeah. But
And
I would also like to share my thing there.
Yeah, yes, you were online. Yeah, sorry.
I was, and I had a couple of stabs at it, not as kind of tied together as Jakob's constructive approach, but it was more flaky. And I think I'm gonna even skip over the most. The last one I got to, I think I could quite enjoy. So the trait is for any role. There's no like I understand a role can be equipped with many traits. So this is not a characterizing essence for any role, but like so the trait is that being drafty. So that means that like you throw out first and you edit later, like in a draft, right? So you first like throw it on the paper, and then like that's a sketch, that's a draft, and then you refine later. That as a general process. And then I was at this point also working on like what could be the, how to say, the kind of scaffolding in which that would play out. And I borrowed the context of the last example that you showed, Pekko. And so like I only came to kind of describe one context, but I thought it was already a bit maybe funny, is that if the context is in the supermarket, like a shopping situation, being drafty in that shopping situation would mean that you pick any fruit to begin with, like, and only on the way to the cashier do you kind of come to decide which is the one that you want to be keeping.
That has a really interesting quality in this, almost what one could call misuse, that somebody might create a certain kind of structure for a certain context, but you might actually apply it somewhere else intentionally.
So the thing is, like, I only got to writing the supermarket as the first example before we started sharing, but I think like this kind of mindset of being drafty, like to declinate that across, you know, many contexts could be mega fun and like super problematic for everybody else around.
You already did it right now. You said in the very beginning, before you started explaining your structure, I'm only going to pick certain things of what you've written down. So you drafted it and you did it right now.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, yeah, but that in itself is interesting. Like, and I also wrote down catachretic practices, because like that, like catachresis being the misuse of the idea and the conceptual. That there is a whole range of catachretic practices in this space. I mean, I know your use wasn't necessarily catachretic, that it wasn't like you intentionally might apply this to supermarket, but it also includes this idea of like somebody taking structure meant for somewhere else to another context.
Like in a meta move, kind of. But I mean, haven't we kind of almost defined that by the cards structure, that like anything can be applied to anything? So yeah, the meta-ness is kind of in it.
I think there's two things there. There are things that anything can apply to anything, but you can also take something that was meant to apply somewhere intentionally, which is of course an expressive power that people have, and apply it still differently, which in my nerdy terms would be catachretic.
Right.
Yeah, but like both are interesting. Like yeah.
It's kind of card-critic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have others, or?
Yeah, but not. I don't think that they were like as maybe interesting as I was. There was one like, no, that was more kind of, because I think this one was also interesting, maybe because of how it kind of how it was triggered. I had another one which was called. No, I don't think it's. I don't think it's necessary. Just I think leave it at that.
So I'll say one practical point, and then just in terms of summary. So the practical point being that it's by the way, so many of you, or at least here, like Jakob and Eva has met Lawrence, you might remember, who happens to live in Berlin and is a very, I would say, gifted game designer as well. Like, but Lawrence contacted me and expressed this interest of building a kind of strategy of pushing our issues towards like a testing ground, whether it's in Berlin or elsewhere. And of course, I thought of also XORG and Oxels, and so like, and he was actually, having heard Oxels in a very short form, he was very interested in kind of exploring that direction as well. So, but just to say that practically there is this sort of maybe even there gathers a community of people that, among other things, would kind of be experimenting semi-regularly with this kind of play, which then has a bridge towards XORG as well. So that's a like 2 days old stem of a development, but I think a positive one overall. We'll see where that goes. But then in more summarily fashion, like for me, while it's very like early, like this sort of very early growths, like, but this kind of direction and kind of creation in this sort of drafty way is pointing out how there's these kind of things that in and of themselves are abstract can be turned into experience, but also skill, like, and maybe knowledge about like what kind of things can do what kind of things. And like being able to figure out the practicality of this, the practicality of these directions that we have been outlining in a way, like mapping out as in an abstract sense that there is this area, but then like how to walk towards that area is like there are ways of making baby steps towards that area in what we have been doing right now here. I don't know if you agree, but that's my, and I do think there is a kind of more general quality to that actually making these baby steps is important, because like that builds this sort of skill of an understanding of how to express in this kind of manner, which then builds more detailed takes, more full expressions towards this space.
Your sound is back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have to say from my side that I enjoyed this very much, and I think it means also, like for me, it means a feeling of like getting to, coming to terms with what are we in here really?
Yeah.
And what do these things look like? And how can they be used? And what color can flow in and all other kind of complication at the same time. So I'm all go for even like baby stepping through whatever, and really practically kind of shaping this kind of together, like experimentally, and but also maybe like, so because what I now did, and I'm sure Jakob, you also did that, like it was I just take some notes now. And so I guess there is also maybe some fundus that one can create for oneself or for us as a group, of these experiments, of these examples, of the questions that are being discussed, in addition to the recordings that we of course have, but like in a different kind of temporal maybe access.
Yeah, so like making some outputs, like small.
I mean, just like maybe just to record to begin with, but then like to think what, because I think that the sensitivity that certainly Pekko you have instilled in me, or our exercises have instilled in me to like being careful with what form to choose for what kind of intent and time is really, really necessary. But like on the other, I mean, like now I just took some notes and I thought that's great because they clarified a lot for me right now together with this play. And I don't know, maybe if we want to be doing that a bit across some
We could
of the
make
parts.
make it a mini game, how to make the notes and
Mhm.
kind of like
Yeah, but I
create
mean,
an XORG activity.
yeah. But I mean, it is. It's all explorative while we do it, right?
Mhm.
Like it's all kind of question. I'm not charting a manual for anybody. It's like record of what's going on. So I think it's fun.
Yeah, but I also think like it's like first of all in agreement with your like drafting the direction. But I think like doing that is really the way to come to the point of being able to express these things. And this is kind of like my one of my major aims in this session, that maybe there is this way, precisely doing it very simply, to start with not like here's the best example, but actually start with just like describing the bridge to come to the space, and with the crudest of terms, but still functional terms, and then like how that kind of allows walking in this landscape.
Totally. Yeah.
And
it's kind of paper and glue, scissors types of approach.
yeah. And really the kind of difference being like it's like like even in like if one takes writing, there was like a concern of content, there was concern of form, but this is kind of beyond that. It's concern of forms relating to forms, and therefore forming systems. And while in writing there was a concern of interpretation and meaning, here there's also a concern of what kind of behaviors it like the communication is merely not telling. The communication is actually creating operative basis, which is a huge expansion or huge change, or and that for me is rather interesting. That of course, like one can say that in a general level, but this is kind of giving patterns of how to address that generality and how to turn it into practical instances in itself. And like learning good ways to do it, the best way to learn it is to walk through it, like, and find like it's like a new landscape, and you, by walking in it, you find the nuggets contained within it, like the best, like better than looking abstractly towards it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, because this is, I guess, still kind of circles back, because I'm trying to assess in what ways, or whether this need of mine to at the beginning wrap it in some kind of at least like temporary purpose, whether this is the specific of my brain, or whether, because it seems to me like, for example, if I took this room, and in this room there is so many things, I don't know, there is like bottles, or there is a book, and I could now say, oh, but I could use those to paint pictures. So I could take a bottle and paint a picture, and then I could take the guitar string to paint a picture. So there is this expressive capacities like widening. But for me, it's at this point, it feels like I'm hoarding operations that I could use to do something. And unless I construct small, at least like narrative arcs, and I guess this is again repeating the topic that I'm always repeating for myself, it's like relating it to some small temporary exercise purpose, that it, as if it was a part of the oxelization of itself, because without it I don't remember much, and it just kind of, it's like those expressive Lego blocks which then I forget. But now which I connected it to this like small purpose that was personally relevant, then there is a higher chance for me that the exercise is somehow sticking. Or but I'm still figuring out that, like, whether that it's my ADHD brain which needs this extra step, or whether it's
I think it's normal. I think it's totally normal. Like you need to kind of I mean, you can understand, you can have somebody tell you how modeling clay works, but you really understand how modeling clay works when you start using modeling clay.
Yeah, I do agree. Like, I might have my own fixations of being more in the abstract sometimes, but I do think it's generally useful for all contexts, including myself, to kind of build concreteness or specificness towards it. But like, a couple of things to underline from this is like,
I need to soon go, guys. Also,
yeah,
just to say
yeah, just kind of final words. But this kind of approach doesn't put a kind of contest between the specific and the general, because like this kind of context you can use the specific to understand new things about the general as well. Like you create this particular form, but it at the same time, in sense of structure, also informs other possibilities in itself. Like there's no contest there. Like you can make something even for a specific case.
Yes.
While I do think like both sides are important. Like even like different facilitation methods, and well, pick any field. Like everything is both kind of like making a specific case, but then implying something for further cases, like further possibilities. And so both sides are important, and this is why I think it's important to come to this state where both can feed the other. But I do think like this kind of direction points that out. And the key thing you need there is as high an expressivity on a systematic area as you have on, roughly speaking, the content area. That opens that up, and like and that here is sort of at least outlined that how that is possible in itself. Any last comments?
thanks, great, more of this.
Yeah, yes, agreed.
Thank you.
Much enjoyable.
I will say goodbye to the potential people by ending the recording here.